Thank you for joining me this evening. I hope everyone is excited to be here as I am. First of all, I live in New York, so I want to apologize for any sounds you might be hearing. Just letting you know that in advance. Also, feel free to raise your hand. I don't know if there's a function, or just grab my attention if you have any questions during this talk. All right, let's get started. So the three things I hope you walk away from this talk with is first, an understanding of intersectionality. The second is an idea of the field of cognitive science and what you can do with it. And then also a new approach to understanding individual differences. Okay, so I'll begin with introducing myself. I am a second generation Ghanaian American, meaning that my parents are from Ghana and I was born and raised in Maryland. I'm a graduate of the University of Maryland, College Park. I was a psychology major and I minored in neuroscience and philosophy. I was also a McNair Scholar, which is a program for underrepresented students who want to pursue PhD programs. So if that's something that you're interested in, definitely look into the McNair Scholars program. And also, I'm currently a cognitive science PhD candidate at Brown University. I'm currently in New York finishing up some dissertation work at Columbia University. Additionally, I'm the educational research lead for an academy in Japan. I also offer research-based consulting and public speaking services as well. So now that I've introduced myself, I'd like you to share some words that you would use to define or describe who you are. Anyone can chime in.
I'll go first, I guess. Oops, I can type it in the chat. Wait.
Oh, go ahead, you can talk. I'd love it if you guys could talk.
Okay. Well, I like to describe myself as like a curious person. Like I like learning new things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Awesome. Curious. Anyone else have any words they want to share? Okay. Remember, you can always chime in. All right, so let's jump right into it. Some of you may have heard the term intersectionality, and you might be wondering what it is. This term has been widely popularized, especially lately during the Black Lives Movement, Matters movement, and everything going on with social justice movements in general. And it's a little bit controversial, but in short, intersectionality is a theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities intersect and interact to create unique modes of discrimination and privilege. So that's a mouthful, but we're gonna break it down together. I wanna emphasize that intersectionality isn't an additive function. So it's not that you're blue and you're an alien and you like cheese, right? It's that you are a blue alien that likes cheese. And that's like my weird example of saying that. It's not that your identities are separate, it's that they're all in one and they compound. And that shapes how you experience the world and how the world also experiences you. And we'll go a little bit further into that. So first we'll unpack what social and political identities are. They can be genetic or biological factors, so your height, your physical appearance, or they could be socially constructed like race and gender. But in general, they're basically descriptors of you as a person, and they can include gender, sex, race, class, sexuality, religion, disability, physical appearance, height, all these different things that we use to describe ourselves and other people. So earlier when I introduced myself, I used some of my social and political identities. Not only do I use them to describe myself, but these identities inform who I am and some of my personal and professional goals. And we'll dig a little deeper into that. But before then, I want to ask how your identities have informed your personal and your professional goals. And it doesn't have to be anything groundbreaking. It could just be hobbies that you're into, or if you're an undergrad already, what majors you're doing, or what sort of long-term ideas for yourself that you have. Does anyone want to share? right. So, like I said, my identities have informed the work that I do. Specifically, that I take an interdisciplinary approach to the research that I conduct. Um, my identities intersect and interact in a way where I'm able to center my experiences as well as those of other marginalized people and take that perspective to see the advantages of adverse circumstances. So a lot of the times there's discussion of deficit models. So if you grew up somewhere where there's high crime or there's war or there's poverty, a lot of the times the discussion is surrounding the fact that it causes deficits to you and your mental abilities. But when I do my research, I like to see and center how it's advantageous. So there's lots of literature out there, and they found that specifically for working memory, which I won't go too deep into, basically that's how you sort of plan, make decisions, and move around the world. There are benefits if you grew up in an adverse environment when you're tested in an adverse environment. So if a person isn't from that environment, they may not do as well. So there's different ways to understand people's experiences and use that to describe how they perform in the world. So again, going back to the idea that your identities compound, it's not the case that I'm sometimes Black or a woman or I'm a child of an immigrant, but it's the case that I'm all of these things all the time, but depending on the situation, there'll be a different emphasis on those identities and how they sort of shape my experience. So I broke down the one identity I have as a Ghanaian American. That means that I am a child of an immigrant, I'm second generation. That means I'm also a first gen college student here in America, which also has its own subset of challenges and experiences that go with it. And then I've also had experience with different social services and programming. And so I can bring all of that together and tie that into my approach to my research. So I keep talking about my research and I'm doing this degree, but I haven't exactly told you what all that means. So now that I've explained my identities, we'll talk about what cognitive science is. So cognitive science is an interdisciplinary scientific study of the mind, specifically in terms of cognition, which is the way people think and process just all the technical stuff about your brain, right? It combines methods and theories from fields such as psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and computer science. So we take the best bits from it all and use it to understand how you think, how I think, and how we think together. So because of the fact that there's so many different fields that are incorporated into the field of cognitive science, I like to categorize the methods we use as either traditional or non-traditional. So in terms of traditional, that's where you get methods like what you see here. I'm not sure if my cursor is showing, but where the people are looking through that window. That's one of the more traditional psychology experiments where there's a testing room, there might be an outside observer, interview styles, so surveys, interview, oral history, focus groups, all of that stuff that you think of when you think of a psychology experiment. That's what I would call traditional. And then the non-traditional methods are more of what you see when you think of like neuroimaging and computational models. And so neuroimaging, that's where you get fMRI, PET, MEG, EEG, FNIRS, and these are all ways of looking at how the brain is functioning during a task or during rest to understand the processes, the mechanisms, and the relationships between different brain regions. And computational models can be used to either model those neuroimaging images, or they can be used to model what we see behaviorally in those traditional methods of experimentation that I mentioned. Okay. So I said a bunch of stuff about what cognitive science is. You might be wondering what you can do with it. There's a lot that we do, so you learn a lot of really valuable skills. And then these skills can be taken and used all throughout. So these all can be entered into, these fields can be entered into with a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, or a PhD. But again, the level and the type of work that you would be doing is dependent on the degree that you attain. So you could do advertising and marketing. And that's where the discussion of the focus groups and the interviews comes in, having the skills to be able to ascertain what people are interested in, what they find valuable, what's likable, and what they're willing to spend their time and money on. That's a skill that you learn through studying people's minds and their decision making. So that's one. Artificial intelligence is essentially trying to mimic the brain. So we're learning about how the brain works, and we want to teach computers how to think like we do. So that's where artificial intelligence comes into play. There's a traditional academic teaching and research. So that's a professor that you might have. A lot of times they'll do research as well. And so that's a field that you can go into depending on what your interests are. There's consulting, and that's another big umbrella. Like I mentioned, I do academic consulting. So there's education policy, there's social policy, and a lot of the times they want people who have this wide range of understanding, and they would come to you to influence what decisions they make and what they put into practice. There's also clinical and medical research, and that's more on the end of industry. You might be doing like something with a clinician, and there might be drug trials, but then you might see how that plays into everyday life, how it impacts something like working memory performance, a drug that's been tested. Data analysis and data science. Data science is a really big field right now. Depending on what company you work for, you do different things, but you would be taking those computational skills specifically and the statistics skills that you learn as a cognitive scientist and apply that in that field. There's also game design if you are more artsy. I'm not a very artsy person, but you can take those skills and design games and websites and whatever it is that your heart desires, because you do learn a lot of that coding in cognitive science. Machine learning, I put the diagram here about the hierarchy of AI to machine learning to deep learning. If you're interested in that, we can talk more about it in the end, but learning about the mind and applying it to computers there's a world of opportunity, from self-driving cars to some people at Brown, they're making little robotic pets for elderly people that simulate what it's like to have a cat, but without the responsibility of having to feed it. So you can do all sorts of really wonderful things. And then there's software development and user experience, which are all along the lines of understanding how people process what's appealing to the eye, what catches your attention. Think about Instagram, for example. There's a whole team of people who are doing user experience, who have this knowledge, and they apply it there. All right, so before we can understand individuals, we need to discuss how we would identify differences in general. So we need to talk about the largest demographic, which is a population. I put the little inverted upside down triangle to sort of siphon and simulate what it is. But a population can be as broad as a world population, or I could be talking about the population of a university. So it's really important to specify who is the focus of the question, the study, the observation. And then within a population, you have a group. So within the context of a world population, that could be people that are from South America. And then within the university example, that could be people who are in a specific student org. Individuals, that's the most straightforward. That's you, that's me, that's anyone else that belongs to a group and also belongs to a population as a whole. So within and between these different demographics that I mentioned, the population, the group, and the individual, there's been different arguments for understanding the documented differences between the individuals that belong to those demographics. You've probably heard of it, but there is this debate called the nature versus nurture debate. And that's basically saying that there's a camp of people who believe that a lot of our differences, and almost all of them really, come from nature. Nature is essentially what you're inborn with. So anything that has to do with your genes and hereditary factors, they believe that a lot of the differences we see are because of genetics. The nurture camp of the debate believe that environmental variables really account for those differences. And so that would be your childhood experiences, where you were raised, the relationships you have, the culture you were brought up into. They are staunch believers that that's just the way it is, and it's because of one or the other. For me, I am of the new age of scientists, I guess, and I would say that it's a combination of both. It's a mix between your inborn traits that you have, and then also the experiences. And also, there's an interplay of the two. That's more complicated, but basically, your environment can affect things that you would think are set when you're born because of genetics. So that's also very fascinating. All right. So, like I said, that's the big debate in psychology. But in cognitive science, there's a lot of discussion about identifying the sources of individual differences in cognition. And cognition, again, is just the way that you think and process. So, if you had to name some off the top of your head, what would you think are some sources of individual differences in cognition? So like there might be a group that likes Coke over Pepsi or celery over broccoli. What could be some sources of those individual differences in people? Feel free to turn on your mic and chime in and let me know.
Can I try? So it could probably be what people are exposed to. So for example, if people are exposed to Coke more, they would probably prefer that instead.
That's definitely good. There's definitely some documented evidence of what the mother eats when she's gestating a baby and then what the child likes when they're born and in the world. So it's definitely something that could be exposure. Anyone else?
Maybe I can. Oh, sorry, my dog's barking. I think like the differences in like food interests and everything kind of depends on, like JC said, what they're exposed to as well. Mm-hmm. And I think like after they're born, the food that the mother and their parents provide are very important, and that kind of like depends, like decides what they want to like later on, I guess.
That's definitely along those right lines. Okay, so basically what we're doing is combining what we know from all these different fields. Like I said, there's those studies with the mothers, and that would be more of a medical biological study where they're taking measures of blood, or they're doing food diaries to see what the mother's eating. And then it's also exposure in terms of when you're your own autonomous person, what your daily habits are, or what advertising you're even seeing. That all comes into play. And that's not just, nurture of what it is that your mother ate, but also your environment coming in and impacting what your preferences are as well. So we're looking at all these things. And if we were to go even deeper and look here at this diagram, there's also something called food deserts. And so in some places, certain populations, usually minority populations, where they live in cities or areas where they don't have access to as much fresh food, produce, all of that. It might just be fast food or just like packaged foods. And so if you live in a community where your race and your socioeconomic status is compounding, you might also have different preferences because of what's accessible to you, because of neighborhood restrictions, because of the way zoning works. There's just so many ways in which, your identities can impact what your food preferences are. And it might not just be something superficial of, I just like the color red, so I like Coca-Cola, Okay, so I mentioned socioeconomic status, and socioeconomic status is very interesting because it's an individual difference that's emphasized across lots of fields. It's also unique because it's a source of both inborn and developed differences amongst people. It encompasses multiple identities, and socioeconomic status is basically the composite of measures that sums up a person's education, occupation, income, and as well as subjective measures like social standing. And we use that to assess different things and understand different relationships. Oh, I do want to emphasize that socioeconomic status is not poverty. A lot of the times those terms are used interchangeably, and poverty is basically just the low end of the income spectrum. So when people use the words interchangeably, you're ignoring a whole bunch of different factors that play into someone's socioeconomic status. The income alone is a spectrum. Socioeconomic status is a spectrum that includes someone's income as well. Okay. Are there any questions before I keep going? I feel like I'm going a little fast. I want to give everyone a chance to let me know if there's anything they want clarified. Good? Okay. All right. So what are some differences between people that you've either noticed or heard about? And these could be differences in how people perform, think, or act.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if this is like what you're looking for, but sometimes there are people who are kind of like morning people versus night people. Like they work better in the daytime in the morning, or some people work better at night. Like that's a difference people talk about a lot.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's kind of good. So that could do with like, circadian rhythms, and that also has to do with both what you're born with, but then also your environmental factors, what kind of jobs you might have access to, noise pollution. Like I live in New York now. I don't know if you can hear the saxophone playing, but that could also play into it. So there's a lot of different ways in which reasons for why someone might differ on that side of things. That's a good one. Anyone else have a difference they've noticed?
Like introverts versus extroverts.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely a big one. There's so many different scales for personality and to describe and talk about that, but a lot of that could be attributed to culture, especially if you're talking about broadly individualistic or collectivist cultures, and if it's patriarchal, or if you grew up somewhere where children are to be seen and not heard. There's so many ways in which the environment can shape how you are as an introvert or an extrovert. So that's also something interesting. Do we have one more difference that anyone's noticed?
Political beliefs.
Political beliefs. That's very complex. There are people who study that full time. I can't even begin to unpack what all goes into that. But again, that's definitely something where your experiences and your identities play a large role, especially if you are trying to affect change for people who have similar identities to you. So, yeah. Anyone else want to chime in, or should I move on to the next one? All right. So one specific, well-documented group and individual difference in performance is the academic achievement gap. Many of you might have heard of it. There's so much discussion and discourse surrounding it, but basically it's the observed and persistent disparities in measures of educational performance or attainment, however you want to put it, among some subgroups of US students, especially along socioeconomic status and racial and ethnic groups, and even between gender. Again, we talked about how a lot of these are socially constructed, but they have very real impacts in terms of how we see differences in academic achievement. Can someone name a specific academic achievement gap?
Probably like SAT and ACT scores, like standardized testing.
Absolutely. That's definitely a big glaring one. Anyone else?
Like if you are at the reading level in third grade or not, and how that like corresponds with your high school dropout rate.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's even on this. That might actually be what's on the little diagram right here, but that's a big one.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Basically these gaps start early and then they persist, and they persist way past even when we're talking about education. A lot of the times they're documented as persisting throughout your adult life and even into other generations. So that means like how much you're able to earn in a specific career, and then also in terms of intergenerational mobility. So even if, let's say, I go to college, there's actually statistics showing that there's a lesser likelihood of my children being able to maintain that same mobility because of all the different ways in which the world interacts with race and gender and ethnicity. So that achievement gap is just lifelong and generational. So yeah, that was a good one. That was actually on the diagram. All right. So many times, like I said, the gaps are talked about in terms of different groups, and these are specifically marginalized groups. And for anyone who doesn't know what a marginalized group is, marginalized groups are groups and communities that experience discrimination and exclusion because of unequal power relationships across economic, political, and cultural dimensions. So I want you to think about and share, if you'd like, what some of the identities that marginalized students who might be categorized as being on the lower end of the achievement gap, what are some identities that they might hold?
I think there might be like race as well as their personal house status, I guess, with money.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then I'll just kick it to you for the next question. How would you use intersectionality to explain what factors contribute to that academic performance, the difference in their academic performance? You can pass it along to someone else if you'd like.
Wait, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, at least for intersectionality, like, wait, can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, basically, so the first part is what are identities that marginalized students might hold? And then the second part is how would you use intersectionality to explain how those identities contribute to differences in academic performance?
Okay. I would say since intersectionality has to deal a lot with like not only socioeconomic status, but like your race and like your gender and those kinds of things, I would say that because certain like minority groups in the country, statistically have a lower, socioeconomic status, those are directly contributing to the access I think that they would get to like, opportunities that they would get to increase themselves academically. Like they're not going to have because, you know, they are low income status, and then because of their race or because of their gender, maybe if they're growing up like in a patriarchal household, they might not have access to like SAT or ACT prep or even schools that like get funding and those kinds of things for them to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Does anyone want to add before I continue on that point?
Kind of like how the system doesn't set them up for success in a way, like STEM careers and such. There's like kind of a group that naturally kind of succeeds, or like the system in a way is set up for them to succeed, whereas these groups might have a harder time achieving that same level of success due to access, due to like obstacles they face, whether it's like teachers not encouraging them enough or like family, and like it's just, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's all exactly correct. Anyone else want to chime in? So the identities that the students may hold is that they might be lower SES, like we talked about. They might more likely are Black or Latinx. They probably have a earlier immigration generation, basically saying they might be first generation, second generation. Those are typically associated with the academic achievement gap. meaning that they'd probably be a first-gen student, which something that people don't realize is a lot of times those students, especially if there's a language barrier, they might be the ones communicating a lot of things between parents and teachers. They might have to learn how the system works themselves and then advocate for themselves, which that's a challenge in and of itself. It's easy to claim that these differences in intelligence, these are differences in intelligence, but that's not necessarily the case. You guys hit on a lot of really great points as to why there might be academic performance differences. One thing is stereotype threat, which you might have heard of, but there are stereotypes that are pushed on or perceived by people onto different groups of students. And this is about their abilities. And not only is it about their abilities, and that might impact how they personally see themselves, their worth, their value, and their ability to perform in the classroom, but also how the teachers invest in the students. So there are studies showing that you could even do it within the same race. There's a very famous study where teachers were asked to rate students on attractiveness, and they rated blonde hair, blue-eyed children as more attractive. But then it was also documented that the teachers also gave them more time and attention in the classroom. That's really alarming to think that those sort of unconscious biases would lead to differences in how a child would get the materials, the time, the care, and even the attention of the teacher if they noticed that they were having a problem in class. A very big difference, a very big reason for the differences would be a lack of learning materials and enrichment opportunities. So something that's not very well known is that funding for schools and educational programs is dependent on taxes, especially in our country. So if you come from a lower socioeconomic status neighborhood, that might mean that there's not as many high-priced homes, there's not as much taxes being paid, and because the money is kept in neighborhoods where they pay the higher taxes, a wealthy neighborhood might have all the materials, all the technology, all the AP courses, while a neighborhood right next to them might not have anything that's similar to that. And so that's a source of disparity when a child isn't afforded the opportunity to have challenging courses or to have up-to-date software for learning how to do whatever. That automatically puts them at a disadvantage and has nothing to do with their innate ability to perform. That also translates into a lack of means for tutoring and special programming outside of what's offered in the classroom. So if you come from a lower SES home, socioeconomic status home, there's a less likely chance that your parents are able to afford that extra outside of the classroom tutoring, or even have that time to dedicate to you if they have to hold down multiple jobs to pay bills, or, you know, these are all like very day-to-day things that are kind of additive in terms of your long-term attainment. And then we talked about standardized testing, and a lot of that is racist and biased. Along with the curriculums that are taught to children. Standardized testing, especially, even if we just talk about intelligence, IQ, intelligence quotient testing, a lot of that is based on European higher status people. So I like to give the example of a IQ test I had to give in undergrad to children I worked with. And I would ask children basically a question where the answer was a matinee. And I don't know very many children who know what a matinee is in general, which is a movie that's shown has like a afternoon or daytime airtime. So it's like, okay, well, who is going to get this right? It's for the person who has been introduced to the term, who has been introduced to the experience, who has that vocabulary. Like, the tests are made in a way where only certain people can perform well, which automatically puts everyone else at a deficit, even though it wasn't created for them. And then a couple other factors are ineffective social and community services. So in some neighborhoods, you might have lots of community engagement. There's neighborhood gatherings, there's boys and girls groups, and then some there might not be there. And even more on the extreme end, there might just be adverse home and neighborhood environments. So if there's high crime or the home environment is not conducive to just a happy, healthy household full of emotional and cognitive enrichment, that's something that's going to play out in the classroom as well. So I pushed through quickly to leave some time for questions. Sorry for the late start, everyone. But before we get to questions, if you want to learn more about me, my work, and my services, here is my info. Does anyone have any questions or anything they want me to go back on and expand on and kind of talk through?
I have a question. So I was wondering, like, how you knew and how you realized that you were interested in. I heard that you did your undergraduate with psychology and minor in neuroscience and philosophy.
Mhm.
So I wonder how you actually realized that you were interested in it and why you wanted to pursue it.
Yeah, so in high school, I took a psychology class and I loved it. The idea of understanding how people think and develop and become who they are was really fascinating. So when I went to college, it was like, oh, I'm going to be a clinician. Like, I'm going to become a clinical psychologist. I'm going to do therapy. And then I quickly realized that wasn't for me. I love talking to people, but people go through a lot of heavy things, and that end of things just wasn't for me. So I worked in a few different labs. The first one I worked in was an interpersonal relationships lab. And basically that was me watching couples talk about problems they had and coding the conversations and the interactions. And I didn't really like the adult work, but I did like the idea of like the social dynamics. After that, I worked in a developmental lab, and there I worked with middle childhood age children, so like 7 to 13, and I did fMRI work. So it was on social cognition, and so we would show them videos in the fMRI brain scanner, and we would ask them questions, and we would learn about their understanding of other people, which is called theory of mind. So thinking about how other people think, which is very meta, but it was really, really cool. And so I really liked the idea of learning about how children develop and become who they become as adults. But I was specifically interested in studying it in a naturalistic way. Putting someone in a brain scanner, as cool as the results are, that's not how we walk around the world. We don't have a big donut machine on our head and it's glowing and buzzing and we have to lay still. So when I went to grad school, I knew that I wanted to study children in an environment that was naturalistic, that mimicked their real lives, so I could get a better understanding of that development and the actual applications. So I basically put together all my different interests and experiences. I was a neuroscience and philosophy double minor. So in those places, especially in philosophy, I thought a lot about consciousness and how we sort of process right and wrong and morality. And so a lot of that stuff came into play. And then neuroscience gave me the background of doing animal work. So figuring out what you want to do is a lot of figuring out what you don't want to do. So I know I didn't want to do animal work. I know I didn't want to work with adults, but I learned that through trying different labs and courses and really honing in on what I was passionate about.
I also have a question. I was planning on like for university double majoring in like neuroscience, like political science, but I was wondering like if you're like during your time at university, if there's a lot of opportunities like since you're doing like intersectional studies and those kinds of things to intersect like politics and neuroscience at all.
Yeah, I actually have a friend who did business and then minored in neuroscience for undergrad. And then as a grad student, I've taken economics and education courses. I think if you learn a lot by looking at a program's website or a university's website, and there's an emphasis on working with different departments or collaborating or courses that are in one department that could apply to another, that really highlights if that's a place where you'll be able to really foster your passion for different fields that aren't necessarily put together all the time. So there's definitely room to fit that in, and you can develop your own little niche there of neuroscience and political science, and there are people who study like decision making, and that's something that I know is really heavily thought about in politics, but a lot of the people who just do politics don't understand the brain mechanisms and the decision making part of it. So you can bring a really unique take when you combine different fields that way.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I wanted to ask, do you feel like was there a specific reason why you chose Brown University? Is there something you really love about it? I'm also interested in potentially getting a PhD eventually, and I was just kind of curious, why you specifically chose them, because I really like them. I think, they have a lot of cool resources, but I would love to hear like your personal thoughts and stuff.
Yeah, so I applied to about 6 to 8 programs. I interviewed with a few different ones. And like I said, a focus on interdisciplinary studies was super important to me. I knew that I wanted to incorporate education, economics, neuroscience, computer science, psychology, all of that into the work I wanted to do. And Brown is literally the school for interdisciplinary studies. They have an open curriculum. They don't even call their majors majors. They have concentration, so you can have this one concentration, but then you incorporate different courses into it. As a PhD student, I had the freedom to go into other departments and take those classes. I know so many different professors now, and that leads to different opportunities. So Brown was the university that really made it the most possible to do the work I wanted to do with the amount of differing, varying interests that I had. So I definitely like that. There's definitely also a lot of community there. So even though I've moved and even during COVID, I still have communication with everyone that's meaningful to me. The deans, the professors, they're in touch. I feel like I'm being supported. So that was also something that when I was looking at the school, I definitely asked questions about programming, opportunities, support, and all of that. And Brown checked off the list for me. Is there anything else about Brown that you're interested in learning about?
Let's see. I have a lot of interest in Brown, but I would say, I don't know, what are some of your favorite aspects about Brown?
So I would say the curiosity and then the room for curiosity. I've TA'd, so I've been the teaching assistant for a few different courses, and it's really fascinating to see how the students engage with the courses and the professors and their peers. So I know as an undergrad, even if I had an idea, I felt really shy about talking about it or asking questions. And there's this environment that really reinforces and encourages that curiosity at Brown. So that's definitely something that I appreciate and I love to see, is that it really allows you to be who you are and to learn and develop and grow in the way that you see fit. And that's something that I really, really like.
That sounds amazing. Do you feel like Brown has had enough resources to support your aspirations in cognitive science?
Yeah. What was it, my first year? I went to a conference in Berlin for my field, and that was a really amazing opportunity. I met a professor who is in the Netherlands who was on a committee for me. So they're open to that sort of collaboration. So I really got the opportunity to meet someone who did something really niche that I wouldn't have access to if I hadn't been afforded the opportunity to go to that conference. So yeah, I definitely have had the support to develop the sort of programming that I needed for myself.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? About literally anything.
I feel like you may have touched on this a little bit, but how do you think media affects the way like people think? I know it's like a really broad question, but like in general.
So my best friend actually is doing a communications neuroscience PhD at Penn. So we have this conversation a lot. I think it's multifaceted in that if we talk about social media specifically, I think a lot of the times people assume that people are more intentional with how they engage with it. And especially during this period of time where a lot of people are doing activism online, I think the assumption is that the reach is further and more long-term than it is. But I think that because of what I talked about in terms of like user experience and the ease of use and how you can quickly sift through so much information, that I think a lot of it's really superficial. So me personally, I think the way we engage with social media is passive, and a lot of the impact isn't what we would like. So in terms of the deep hardcore information setting in, I think it's less so of that and more of like the advertising and the lifestyle sort of aspects are what are more long-term than the informational side of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't know, that just kind of blows my mind how like it's such a big part of our lives now, I guess, that we have the technology to reach so many people from around the world, and it just kind of influences a lot about the ways like people live their lives and stuff. So yeah,
it's very overwhelming and then also underwhelming at the same time.
yeah. Thank you so much, by the way.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone else have any questions or any advice that they want on anything?
Actually, I was also wondering, just in terms of advice, like, I know like STEM is pretty difficult, and I do want to have, like I said, a double major and probably a minor. So just like, how did you navigate obtaining a STEM degree, especially with like the workload and all the other, aspects of like university and stuff you have to do?
Yeah, so for me, I think the thing that helped me the most was having some self-imposed structure. So for me, that came in the shape of employment. So I worked throughout undergrad. I also did research. I was in a living learning community. So I inadvertently kind of created confines around when I would go to class. I mean, you only have a certain amount of time you're supposed to be in class, but the time I had allotted for my schoolwork and then for socializing. So what it did for me was that it didn't make it seem impossible, because I think a lot of times what happens is that there's so much to do all the time and you get stressed out, and when you're stressed you don't want to do anything, in my case. And so it creates this like vicious cycle where everything is overwhelming. But if I know that in a given day I have 6 hours to do work and socialize, it feels more attainable. And I just think of it as pick a few things you're going to tackle. You do it. What you get done is what you get done. You reassess and then you move on. When there's too much time in your mind, I think it does a lot of stuff. So that, and then also something I didn't do was taking advantage of the resources made available, going to office hours for your professor, your TA, doing study groups, or even just someone who you go to compare answers for like that chem test that you did. Let's work through the problem that I got wrong that you got right. Just little things where it seems like the world is like melting around you, but if you just like turn your head a little bit, there's a solution or someone who's like reaching out to help. So structuring, and then also taking advantage of everything that's there for you, because there's a lot of support systems. Even if they may not come to you, you need to advocate for yourself. And that's definitely something that I didn't start doing until I went to grad school. So yeah. Anyone else?
So like since we're all in quarantine and because of COVID, I was wondering how you're dealing with the online learning and virtual learning and things.
Yeah, so it was definitely difficult in the beginning. During the spring semester, I was both teaching a class and taking a class. And so that transition was pretty difficult. I would say I think the days all sort of run together, and a lot of the times I don't know what day of the week it is or what's going on, and I know people feel they can recognize that, but what I do is, again, like taking things slow and kind of building up. So I make a big to-do list for the week, and then I'll break that down between days. And then some people will even chunk that out into hours, and just allowing yourself room to breathe. Everything is overwhelming right now. Everything is a lot and nothing at all. And so just like stepping away and then coming back is also important. So it's just a lot of chunking that I do to sort of get by and through. The virtual learning stuff, I'm still figuring it out. I don't know how anyone does it, but I just think that communicating your needs is important. So if there's a method or a way that someone is doing something and it doesn't work for you, feel free to be vocal, because we've all been different types of learners. And before, the focus was, oh, I'm a visual, or I like write things, but now it's, we all have to be virtual. So what can we do to make it more accessible or easier for each individual? So I know for me, I like to take handwritten notes, and that's not going to change. So if, let's say, a professor is going too fast and I have to like look at the screen and do this, you know, if there's a function to ask them to slow down, that's something that you can do. Just identifying your needs and not feeling like you have to hold them within and just go along with what everyone's doing, because that's just not possible for everyone. So again, advocating for yourself is important.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, what courses would you recommend for someone who's interested in cognitive science but doesn't know how to kind of get into the field? And I'm homeschooled, so I feel like it's really interesting hearing about everyone's opinions on virtual learning, because I've been doing it for so long and everyone's had to kind of switch to the virtual thing. So I've been doing it since like 3rd grade, so it's unique.
Yeah, you've been ahead.
Everyone's opinions.
Yeah, you've definitely been ahead. So yeah, courses. So a lot of what I learned in my psych, philosophy, and neuroscience courses applied, but a good chunk of what I needed to navigate this program came from what I learned in lab. So when I started working in the first fMRI lab I worked in with the children, I learned how to code. That was a game changer for me, because now right now I use MATLAB, but I learned Python and R back then. And that was to process the fMRI data, to look at the images, to create the 3D models of the brains. I learned how to do it for that specific reason. And so that was helpful. But now as a grad student, I use it to create the computer games that the participants play in my study. So if you don't take a formal coding, programming language course, definitely get involved in a lab or a enrichment opportunity where they teach you how to use it in a task-oriented way. And that's how I learned. I don't think I would have been able to learn in a classroom setting. I needed to do hands-on applied methods of learning how to code, but that's something that I would definitely highlight, is just kind of get in there and learn how to use some sort of a language so that you're able to do whatever it is your heart desires in grad school or in the field in general. A research methods course is super important. Knowing the terminology, learning the history, kind of touching on the ethics, that's super important when you're in this field. And then also, I would say take classes that just pique your interest. They may not be aligned with the work you're trying to do. A lot of how I came to specialize came from a random course that I took. I became a philosophy minor because my first year of undergrad, I took this philosophy course that was just on like controversial topics. And I took it as just an elective, and that kind of kickstarted my interest in philosophy. So if something just kind of sparked your interest, I say entertain it a little bit, because you don't know what could come from it. And as someone that's in cognitive science, every sort of thing that you think about that's important or entertaining, it could turn into something that's a discovery about the human mind. So allow yourself to just explore. That's definitely really important when you're trying to enter cognitive science. Everything is valuable and everything is an opportunity to gain a further understanding of how we exist as humans and how we process the world.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic response.
Thank you.
I have a question. I know that your focus is education and cognitive science, and I also am interested in cognitive science and education. So what type of like career prospects do you see in that? And like, is it more research based, or are there other type of careers that you can go into?
Yeah, so the first and like most like first glance thing people would talk about is being a professor and teaching courses and doing research. That's definitely the way that people go. That's the route. The professor I work with, that's what she does. But if you want to venture outside of that, there's consulting, which I've been doing, where I've basically been using the literature and the skills that I've learned to help this school in Japan develop a research-based curriculum. I love that work. And what that could turn into is education policy work overall within the States or elsewhere. And I see a lot of value in applying these academia-centered skills into the real world. We have so much knowledge, there's so much research out there, but so little of it is applied. And there's a lot of change that could be imparted in that way. Another route is industry. And like I said, there's so much you can do with industry. Hyundai actually, there's a lab in my department at Brown who won a grant from Hyundai to help them create the AI for their self-driving cars. And that's just one of them. There's a lot of Department of Defense work where I have a friend who does bat work and they're doing the research of the bats to create technology for seeing in the dark and echolocation for military grade equipment. There's so much that you can do with these sort of perceptive and cognitive research that we do. What else do people do in industry? People create different apps and programs and educational tools. There's actually a lot of different things you can do. For myself, I haven't decided yet, but I'm in my 4th year, so I'm starting to really entertain the different ones. But if there's any fields in particular or jobs that you want me to talk about a little bit more, I can do that because I've kind of been diving into that more.
I don't have like anything in really particular, just because I know cognitive science combines so many different, it's like so interdisciplinary that like there can be so many different avenues you can take with it. So is that like, that's kind of like my question is like, if you major in like cognitive science, is it easy to like do jobs that maybe are like, for example, like AI, like people like, I think majority of them either have like comp sci majors or they have like machine learning or something like that, like along those lines. But like, is it as easy to do not really like a tech job, but also like any type of job, like I guess with like a cognitive science major?
So with anything, I think it's about selling yourself and the skill set that you've developed. So that, and also picking and choosing strategically what you'll spend the most time on. So let's say you don't know, but you know you're definitely enjoying the programming side of things and you want to develop, or you go on to like Google DeepMind and you play with some neural networks and it's kind of fun. You might decide to spend more time on the computer science end of things and really hone in on that. And then when it comes time for entering the workforce or applying to jobs in general, you'll definitely hit on and emphasize the fact that you have these skills. You don't need a computer science degree to do a lot of the tech jobs. That's just what's traditionally been there. And that's what's really cool about being in a new non-traditional STEM field, is that you can sell what you want to sell. You don't have to sell what you don't want to sell. And you can pick and choose the techniques and the methods that are going to serve you the best. So you may not have an idea, so then you might just go the well-rounded end of things and get that neuroscience experience, that computer science experience, a psych experience, a philosophy, So then when you come out, you can go to whatever job and say, hey, this is the skill set, this is the knowledge set that I have, this is what you're asking for, this is how I'm able to fulfill those roles and positions. So it's definitely about selling yourself when you're not sure of what you want to do. But if you do have a vague idea, it's going to be about really spending that time to develop those skills.
Thank you.
I was also wondering, like, for I know that some universities kind of have like just study abroad, but also I was planning, like I said, graduating like with a double major. But after I get like, I guess some more advanced degrees, I was planning on moving like outside of the U.S. And I was wondering, like, at least in your experience with Brown, but just as a college student, I know some universities have like job centers or like career centers and that kind of stuff. Do you know like how some universities like help facilitate those who want to kind of move abroad and get jobs abroad?
Yeah, so Brown specifically has the Careers at Brown, the CAB Center. And then also a lot of universities understand that we live in this global economy now. And so they are going to accommodate and help you with those needs. Also, when it comes to going to grad school, a lot of universities are open to international students. So let's say you decide to go abroad to work and then you want to pursue a degree. I have a friend who did neuroscience here and then like got a job in Spain teaching and doing whatever else. So there wasn't much of a lag in between that. So I think you're going into not like currently now because coronavirus, but there's a future where people are very understanding of different backgrounds, different education, relocating. It's a global economy. So that I think if you definitely are prepared for what it is you want to get into, the international barrier might just be more of a formality of visas and being supported by a company or a school more than you're not equipped to work elsewhere or learn elsewhere.
Thank you.
So under the Curious and Cognitive Science, there's advertising and marketing. And I was wondering if like that's kind of similar to like consumer psychology, I guess.
Yeah, there's industrial organizational psychology, and that's definitely been like a big, booming, popular field. And that's basically applying all these things we know about preferences, experience, how people shop, and all of that, or even like group and crowd mentalities, and applying that to marketing and business. Before, I think there was a lot of shooting in the dark. But now we have this understanding about how people navigate and choose and participate in the economy. We're going to apply it. And who better than someone who's studied the field, knows the research, can go and conduct the research for a specific product or a program. So that's what that is, the advertising marketing. I would classify that under industrial organizational or IO. That's usually how they refer to it, as IO. Any more questions? All right. Well then, one more.
I also have the last question. So I'm currently a high school freshman, and I'm like still figuring out what I want to do, but I'm kind of interested in human behavior and like how people think in such ways. So I'm thinking of majoring in neuroscience later on, but could you recommend a way for me to actually like get to know more about neuroscience and like learn more about them?
So I guess the first thing I would do is to see if your school offers a psych, a neuroscience sort of coursework. It could be an AP class, it could be just a standard course. That's the first place I would start. And then not only taking the class, but talking to the teacher, because they themselves have that background. They can talk to you about what the career or the university program would look like. They're a really invaluable resource in that way. If that's not readily available, I would look to the different societies and organizations. So there's like APA, which is the American Psychological Association or something, whichever one is for neuroscience. There's a ton depending on specific interests. So there's Flux, which is for Society for like Neuroscience and Development specifically. So just looking up and at different organizations and groups that center that work, and they might have different handouts that you can read, or they might have different seminars that you could attend. So you may not be getting that formal education, but you are tapped into that network. You're learning straight from the people that you would want to work with anyways. And exploring that curiosity in other ways. The internet is massive. There's lots of videos, there's different interest groups, so you could go about it that way. Or again, let's say you go and look at these organizations and there's a professor or something that, or someone that you want to talk to, go ahead and shoot them an email. I think that's something that a lot of people are really shy about, but they're people too. They were once in your position. And so reaching out, they might have a high school lab position. My friend that I mentioned that did neuroscience, he actually worked in a lab at Johns Hopkins as a high schooler. So he got in there, he was doing like ridiculous like brain stuff with mice in high school. And so that was his in, and then he ended up going to Johns Hopkins. So like you can reach out and you never know what opportunities are there. The worst they could say is no, or they don't have anything, but at least you set up that dialogue and reached out to someone about something that you were really genuinely interested in.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, so if no one has any more questions, I want to thank you guys for coming tonight. I enjoyed being here. Hopefully you learned something new or got a question answered. This was fun. Thank you.